Green Bay, Wisconsin had always been the kind of town where silence felt safe. The streets were steady, the snow came like clockwork. People knew their neighbors. You could leave your porch light off and still feel protected. But in the last week of February 2022, something broke in that delicate silence. Something so twisted, so unhinged, that it tore a hole in the town's calm, like a scream echoing through still air. It started, like most nightmares, with a mother. The kind of mother who worried when her adult son didn't answer her texts. The kind who quietly descended into the basement of her own home, expecting maybe the mess of an unfinished night, maybe the scent of beer, maybe even the soft snoring of a hangover. But what she found was none of those things. What she found changed her life forever. Because when she stepped into that basement, what greeted her wasn't silence, it was death. In the corner of the room, inside a bucket meant for household cleaning supplies, sat her son's severed head. Bloodied, cold, and horrifyingly still. It took her several long seconds to even register what she was seeing. Her brain refused to accept it. It felt like a hallucination. But the blood was real. The smell was real. And worse, it wasn't just the head. There were bags, heavy black plastic ones. They oozed. Some were torn. And from the rips came pieces of a person, flesh, bone, muscle, no longer arranged as a human being, but scattered like butcher shop remains. She didn't scream at first. She just stood there, shaking, her hands twitching with the unnatural weight of what she had just seen. She backed away slowly, not turning her back, as if the room itself might reach out and drag her in. She ran to her phone, dialed, and when the dispatcher answered, she said the kind of words no parent should ever have to say, "My son, he's in pieces." When police arrived, they could not believe what they saw. Veteran officers, people who had responded to suicides, domestic murders, even meth lab explosions, were shaken. Some couldn't look directly. Some stepped away to vomit. The basement was not just a crime scene, it was carnage. It was something pulled out of nightmares. It was destruction without reason, and it was personal. The victim's name was Shad Thyrion, 25 years old, sweet, quiet, trusting. He was the kind of person who didn't light up rooms but steadied them. People described him as gentle, polite, with a softness in his voice that made people listen even when he said little. He had his struggles, sure. Small-town life didn't make it easy for everyone. He had drifted through jobs, through relationships, through identity. But he was deeply loved, especially by his mother, especially by the friends who never stopped hoping he'd catch a break. That hope died in that basement. But the question that hung over everyone's breath wasn't just who could have done this, it was why. Why would someone mutilate a human being like that? Why take not just a life, but dignity? Why tear someone apart, limb by limb, and leave him for his mother to find? The name came quickly, Taylor Schabusiness. She was the last person seen with Shad. Neighbors had noticed her car. A few messages on Shad's phone led straight to her. And when police tracked her down, hours later, with dried blood on her clothes, a distant look in her eyes and no real attempt to hide, she didn't run. She didn't deny. In fact, she seemed disturbingly calm. Officers noted she had wounds on her arms. Her hands were swollen. And in the back seat of her vehicle, tucked under some blankets, were more human remains, organs mostly, pieces of Shad she hadn't finished disposing of. When they asked her what happened, her response was chillingly casual. It got out of hand. Those 4 words would be repeated in news broadcasts, in police reports, in hushed conversations between neighbors. It got out of hand, as if it were a disagreement, as if a human being could just accidentally wind up in bags and buckets because something got out of hand. But for Taylor Schabusiness, the line between impulse and brutality had disappeared long before that night. To understand what happened in that basement, we have to understand Taylor, not as a courtroom defendant, not as a mugshot, but as a person spiraling inward long before she ever picked up a knife. Taylor was not born into horror. She was born into the ordinary, a Midwest upbringing, middle-class limits, a complicated home like many. There were issues, sure, every family has them. But the roots of what she became didn't come from a single event. They came from a slow unraveling, a buildup of chaos that went unnoticed until it became uncontainable. As a teenager, she was erratic, wild, sharp-tongued. She had that explosive kind of charisma that made people both intrigued and unsettled. She laughed louder than everyone else. She took risks no one else would. She pushed boundaries and then burned them down. Drugs entered early: meth, weed, pills. She masked it with humor, with rebellion, with a kind of don't give a damn energy that made her unpredictable, magnetic, dangerous. But underneath it all was a darkness that even she didn't understand. Those closest to her spoke of mood swings that were more than just teenage angst. She could be affectionate, then vicious, caring, then detached. Her eyes would go distant mid-conversation, as if someone else had taken over. She talked about demons, about feeling watched, about not trusting her own mind. And sometimes she hinted at a voice, one that didn't belong to anyone but still told her what to do. But no one took her seriously. She had a child, young. The relationship with the child's father was chaotic, riddled with abuse, custody fights, and emotional instability. Taylor would drift in and out of that child's life. Her family tried to intervene, but it was like trying to catch the smoke in your hands. She disappeared for days, sometimes weeks, and when she returned, she was different, more jittery, more disconnected. She'd talk about love, then mention death in the same breath. When she met Shad, it was unexpected. He was soft. She was sharp. He listened. She overwhelmed. But for some reason, they connected. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was two broken people trying to find someone who wouldn't flinch at the weight they carried. But their relationship wasn't healthy. It was volatile, fueled by drugs, laced with jealousy, defined by confusion. They weren't dating in the conventional sense, more like orbiting each other's chaos. There were nights they'd get high together, nights filled with bizarre conversations, nights that blurred into something neither of them would remember fully. But for Taylor, Shad was someone she could control, someone who wouldn't question her madness, someone who, even as she spiraled, wouldn't let go, until the night she did. That night they had been using meth, again. Meth made Taylor feel invincible, untouchable. It gave her delusions of power, of fantasy, of invulnerability. She'd spoken before about dark fantasies, about wanting to choke someone during sex, about wondering what it would be like to kill, not out of rage, but curiosity. She said she wanted to see what was inside. People laughed it off. She was intense. She was weird, but harmless, right? Except she wasn't. That night in the basement, something inside her finally snapped. Maybe it was the drugs. Maybe it was the trauma. Maybe it was all of it colliding at once. The sex became violent. The violence became death. And when she felt his body go limp, when most people would freeze in horror, Taylor leaned in. She didn't panic. She explored. With a knife she found in the basement, she began to cut. Not hastily, not blindly, but deliberately. She sliced. She examined. She dismembered. The line between reality and fantasy dissolved completely. She stayed for hours, moving pieces, bagging them, leaving some out like trophies. And all the while she smoked more meth, high on destruction, high on control. When investigators later reviewed the basement, what stood out wasn't just the horror, it was the lack of hesitation. The way the scene had been left behind didn't scream panic, it screamed detachment. There was no sign of guilt, no rushed cleanup, no attempt to cover up the crime. It was as if she simply finished what she wanted to do and walked away, leaving the remains as casually as someone might leave behind trash after a party. And in a way, for Taylor Schabusiness, that's exactly what it was. A party of one, soaked in meth, blood, and unchecked madness. The officers found traces of blood smeared along the doorframe in patterns that suggested pacing. At one point, she had gone upstairs, used the sink, eaten a snack, while body parts lay feet away below her. The calmness was what horrified police the most. It was as if something inside her had truly shut off, or worse, switched on. What kind of person could stand over the mutilated body of someone they once kissed and not only remain there but linger. She didn't try to run. She didn't even really try to lie. When they found her later that morning, sitting calmly in someone else's home, she didn't flinch. Her sleeves were stained red, her eyes half-lidded from exhaustion and drugs, and her words came without fear. When asked what happened, she mumbled with a kind of eerie nonchalance, "I blacked out." And then followed that chilling laugh, the kind that didn't belong in grief or fear, but in something far more detached. She wasn't incoherent. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She simply said what she remembered. The choking, the moment his body stopped moving, the feeling of wanting to keep going. She spoke about it like someone recalling a dream, bits and pieces, images, flickers of sensation. But there was no regret. Not a flicker of horror at what she had done. Instead, there was a strange frustration. She had wanted more time, she said, to finish what she started, that it ended too soon. To the officers present, that was the moment they knew they weren't dealing with someone who had snapped in a single moment. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a bad trip gone worse. This was a person who had entertained violence for longer than anyone had realized. Someone who finally gave themselves permission to follow through. The fantasy had won. As her story unfolded in the hours and days after the arrest, a picture began to form, not just of a crime, but of a descent. People came forward, friends, acquaintances, former partners. They spoke of her intensity, the way she made people nervous but fascinated. One ex described her as a human storm, 1 second sunshine, the next destruction. Another recalled nights she'd speak in riddles, watching them from across the room with a blank stare that made their skin crawl. And then there were the drugs. Taylor didn't hide it. She embraced it. Meth was her religion, she once joked. It made her feel powerful, above everyone else. When she used, she said, she could feel the edge of the universe and grip it with her hands. But meth didn't just make her feel powerful. It fed her illusions. It twisted her thoughts. She began to believe she was chosen. That pain wasn't something to avoid. It was something to deliver. That love and death could be one and the same. She started talking about experiments, that the human body was just skin over function, that people were too attached to their vessels. One night, according to someone close to her, she said, "I just want to see inside someone, really inside them, not just metaphorically." And then she laughed. They all laughed. Because how else do you respond when someone says something so unreal? But none of them were laughing now. As the investigation dug deeper, more disturbing details came to light. Shad hadn't just been killed and dismembered. Parts of him were missing entirely. Some were found in her car. Others had been attempted to be disposed of elsewhere. But there were pieces they couldn't recover, and the implication was too horrifying to say aloud. Detectives found items in her home that matched wounds on his body. Tools, blades, cleaning chemicals. The timeline was fuzzy, but what became clear was this. Taylor had stayed with Shad's body for hours, possibly into the next morning. She had smoked more meth during the act. She had moved pieces of him from the basement into her car, planning disposal, but she never made it that far. Whether it was exhaustion, drugs, or simply the breakdown of whatever plans she had, she left the job half done and wandered off. There was no manifesto, no diary, just madness. Her social media pages, which had once been full of erratic posts and strange videos, were quickly shut down. But not before people saw glimpses of her instability. Posts about death, about betrayal, about wanting to escape her body. Videos where she seemed to talk to someone who wasn't there. And one particularly disturbing post just weeks before the murder. "If I disappear, it's because I finally went deep enough." Deep enough. What did that mean? To her, perhaps it was literal. She'd gone into someone's body and taken it apart. She'd crossed the threshold between fantasy and reality, between control and chaos, and she didn't come back. But the story wasn't just about her. Shad's family was shattered. A gentle young man, pulled into something he could never have escaped from. His mother, who found his head, who made that 911 call, was never the same. How could she be? Every hallway in her house now echoed with memory and loss. Every shadow looked like her son. Every silence felt like screaming. She hadn't just lost a child. She had found him dead in a way no mother should ever imagine. And the image wouldn't leave her. It haunted her sleep. It stained her heart. Friends described Shad as trusting to a fault. He didn't judge people, even when Taylor had her outbursts, even when she broke things or shouted nonsense or got violent with herself. He stayed. He listened. He believed she could be helped. He believed in redemption. And in that belief, he paid the ultimate price. There was no grand motive, no revenge, no betrayal. Just an act of horror born out of delusion and meth-fueled madness. And yet the consequences rippled like an earthquake. Shad's death wasn't just a statistic. It was a reminder that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they sit beside us, laugh with us, kiss us, and when their chaos boils over, we don't see it until it's too late. For Green Bay, the case became a kind of whispered warning. That evil doesn't always come with horns. Sometimes it comes wearing eyeliner, talking fast and promising love. The community struggled with how to talk about it. Some shut down, others cried openly. Counselors were called into schools. Mental health hotlines saw a spike. And in every household, parents held their children a little tighter. Because if it could happen to Shad, it could happen to anyone. But through all the noise, one question kept echoing. How did no one stop her? In the weeks that followed the murder, grief began to rot into something heavier. A quiet, suffocating guilt that settled over everyone who had ever crossed paths with Taylor Schabusiness. The guilt of not seeing the signs, the guilt of laughing off the warnings, the guilt of shrugging her madness off as just Taylor being Taylor. Because the truth was, everyone had seen something. Her moods, her drug binges, her bizarre stories, her volatile energy. And yet, no one stopped her, or maybe they tried, and it wasn't enough. Mental health professionals who had brushed by her history now found themselves combing back through notes, wondering what they'd missed. Friends dug through old messages, wondering how close they had come to being the victim instead of Shad. Even those who had cut her off long ago couldn't help but revisit the what-ifs. What if someone had called the police earlier? What if someone had forced her into treatment? What if someone had pulled Shad away from her, just once? But guilt is a dead-end road, and for most it was already too late. Taylor had drifted for years, falling through the cracks of every system that might have helped her. There were whispers of childhood trauma, of abuse, of early psychiatric episodes that were dismissed or misdiagnosed. School records showed behavior issues from early on, violent outbursts, paranoia, extreme mood swings. But like many kids in under-resourced towns, she was labeled difficult, not damaged. And difficult children rarely get the help they need. They get pushed aside, suspended, moved around, forgotten. By the time she reached adulthood, Taylor wasn't looking for help anymore. She was looking for control. In a world where she felt powerless, meth became her god, and violence became her language. Those close to her knew she'd always harbored dark thoughts. She joked about death, about chaos. But when does a joke stop being a joke? She once told a friend that she believed people were meat suits with energy inside, and she wanted to see what that energy looked like after the suit was gone. Most people dismissed it as drug rambling, but now in retrospect, it sounded like a manifesto. And while the world dissected her story with shock and disgust, what slipped through the cracks again, ironically, was the man she killed. Shad Thyrion, a name quickly eclipsed by the woman who took his life. Headlines screamed about the killer. Rarely did they speak of the victim. Rarely did they say his name. And yet, in quiet corners of Green Bay, his friends lit candles. His mother kept his photo on her dashboard, and his cousins clung to voicemail recordings of him just saying, "Hey, love you. I'll be home soon." Shad had dreams, simple ones. A job, a relationship that didn't hurt. Maybe moving out of his mom's place. He wasn't perfect. He struggled, like many do. But he tried. He tried to be kind, to stay hopeful, even when life kept knocking him down. He trusted people too easily. That was his nature, and that's what made him vulnerable. To Taylor, he wasn't just a friend. He was a mirror, reflecting a version of herself she couldn't destroy unless she destroyed him. There was something about Shad that unsettled Taylor in a way she couldn't understand. His softness, his patience, the way he looked at her without judgment. It infuriated her. It confused her. And perhaps in some twisted corner of her mind, it made her feel small, powerless. And so she did what monsters do when they feel small. They strike. But Shad didn't go quietly. His death was brutal, but his memory lingered louder than the crime. In parks where he used to skateboard, friends carved his name into railings. His mother started attending grief circles, not to talk about what happened, but to make sure he wasn't forgotten. In a town drowning in shock, it was easy to lose sight of the person behind the tragedy. But for those who loved him, forgetting wasn't an option. Meanwhile, Taylor sat in a sterile room somewhere, her world narrowed to white walls and steel bars. Her mind likely spiraling, or maybe eerily calm. But whatever she felt, it wasn't remorse. That much had become clear. In interviews, she spoke of the murder like a strange dream, detached and flat. And when pressed about Shad, she would blink slowly, almost confused by the question. As if the person she killed was just a chapter, not a soul, not a life. And yet, this wasn't a story about evil. That would be too easy, too simple. Evil is a word we use to push people away from us, to mark them as other, so we can sleep at night believing we're safe from ever becoming them. But Taylor wasn't a monster from birth. She was broken, ignored, dismissed, drugged, and left to rot in her own mind. And eventually, she took that rot and spilled it into the world. That doesn't excuse what she did. Nothing can. But it forces a question. How many Taylors are walking among us right now, unnoticed, untreated, unraveling? And how many Shads are loving them, believing they can be fixed right up until the moment they can't? For the town of Green Bay, healing was slow. People avoided the neighborhood where the murder happened. The house stood silent, sealed in trauma. Some whispered it should be torn down. Others believed it should stay, to remind them that horrors don't only live in faraway cities or Netflix series. Sometimes they live next door. The shock began to settle, but the fear remained. Parents grew more cautious. Mental health clinics received more calls. Meth use, which had long been a hidden epidemic in small towns, was suddenly being talked about openly. Not because of statistics, but because of what happened to Shad. Tragedy, as always, had done what awareness campaigns could not. But the deepest wound was invisible, the one left in the hearts of those who knew Shad. There were no answers that made sense. No resolution that brought peace. Just a void, a before and after, a memory frozen in time, and the unshakable truth that trust, when given to the wrong person, can be the most fatal decision of all. In the months that followed Shad's death, time began to do what it always does. It moved forward, whether people were ready or not. But for those closest to him, the world outside felt unreal. Days passed, but inside their minds, the moment everything shattered played in loops. His mother stopped decorating her home. She avoided the basement. She never took down the family photos, but she stopped smiling at them. Grief doesn't just take someone from you, it robs you of who you were before they left. The quiet pain of losing someone to such a violent end is like living with 1,000 unanswered questions. Did he know what was happening? Did he suffer? Was there a moment where he was afraid? And worst of all, could it have been prevented? These weren't just questions, they were wounds. Every attempt to move on reopened them. For those who knew Taylor Schabusiness before the crime, reflection became its own kind of torment. People tried to reconcile the woman they remembered with the acts she committed. They replayed conversations, remembered the moments she stared too long at knives in kitchens, or when she once said casually, "Sometimes I want to break someone just to see what would happen." They thought it was a joke. No one laughed, but no one stopped her either. What haunted people most wasn't the brutality, it was how long it had been building. There was no snap moment, no dramatic breaking point. Taylor had been walking toward that night for years, one step at a time, in full view. She was a storm slowly forming, and no one put up the warnings. There were friends who had drifted from her, saying she became too intense, One woman recalled a night Taylor locked herself in the bathroom during a party, muttering to herself for hours, emerging with a smile that felt like a mask. Another remembered when Taylor, in the middle of a meth high, said she believed humans were soft cages and that the body was just in the way. It was all there. The signs, the symbols, the chaos. But Taylor wasn't always chaos. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, where she showed the remnants of a person who once hoped for more. A childhood photo showed her hugging a puppy with such tenderness it hurt to look at. A school essay, found years later, spoke of wanting to help people, of becoming a vet. But somewhere along the way, life, trauma, and the absence of love did their damage, and the girl in the photo disappeared. People don't become monsters in a day. They're built, slowly, painfully, and often without anyone noticing until it's too late. The tragedy also exposed a deeper, uglier truth about the systems around Taylor. From an early age, she had shown signs of severe mental instability. Her school records included reports of hallucinations, violent fantasies, emotional detachment, and chronic drug use. She'd been suspended multiple times, referred to counseling she never followed through with. She had police interactions. She had medical records with red flags. But she never got better, because no one really intervened. It's easier to lock people up than to help them heal. That's the truth. It's cheaper, it's faster. And in Taylor's case, society did just that. Let her drift, let her fall, let her become someone else's nightmare. But the real horror? Taylor Schabusiness wasn't trying to hide. In her own strange way, she had been begging to be seen. Her erratic behavior, her disturbing posts, her violent outbursts, they weren't just signs, they were warnings. And no one listened. After the murder, community programs were flooded with new urgency. Task forces talked about meth addiction. Local rehab centers got new funding. But for Shad's family, it felt like building a dam after the flood had already drowned the village. Too late. Too late for him. Too late for the life he could have had. And what about the child she left behind? Yes, Taylor had a son, a boy who was now motherless, who would grow up knowing what his mother did, who would carry the weight of her name without ever choosing it. A child born into tragedy he didn't create, his life now forever shadowed by something he could neither understand nor escape. That's the unseen cruelty of these stories. The ripple effects don't end with the victim or the killer. They bleed into everyone who knew them, into children not yet old enough to spell the word homicide, into families that will never laugh the same again. The public began to move on, as they always do. News cycles turned, new scandals arrived, other cases took over the headlines, and Taylor Schabusiness, whose name once echoed across national outlets, became just another file in a system that forgets quickly. People stopped saying Shad's name. Even in Green Bay, the whispers faded, but not for the ones who had to live with it. Shad's bedroom was eventually emptied, his posters taken down. His mother kept a single drawer untouched, one that held his letters, his cologne, his favorite beanie. She said she would never open it again, but couldn't bring herself to throw it away. That drawer became a graveyard of memory. There are no words for the pain of a parent who loses their child in this way. There are only silences, the long, crushing silences that sit in the house after dark, where the echoes of laughter once lived. And through it all, Taylor remained a void, an empty vessel of potential that had curdled into something unrecognizable. Her story, now frozen in horror, served as a mirror to everything society ignores until it explodes. The neglected, the mentally ill, the drug addicted, the dangerous. The signs were always there, but we're not taught to look for them. We're taught to mind our business, to avoid getting involved, to assume someone else will step in, but someone else never does, not in time. And so people like Taylor walk among us, unraveling, waiting, pretending, until one day they stop pretending, and someone like Shad pays the price. Some stories don't end. They just go quiet. They sit in the back of people's minds, in the spaces between conversations, in the tightening of a mother's chest when her phone rings too late at night. The Taylor Schabusiness case wasn't just a murder. It was a haunting, a reminder of what happens when trauma, neglect, and untreated mental illness are allowed to ferment inside someone long enough to rot everything that made them human. Long after the news cycle moved on, long after Taylor's name stopped trending, the people who lived through the ripple of her choices were still picking up the broken pieces. For Shad's family, life became a daily war between memory and survival. There were good days, moments of stillness, of almost forgetting, and then there were the other days. The ones where every corner of the house reminded them of what was lost. The air itself felt heavier, like something unspeakable still lingered in the walls. His mother rarely left the house. She had stopped taking visitors. She didn't attend vigils anymore. People would say, "She's strong," but they didn't see the way she flinched at the sound of the basement door creaking. They didn't see the way she still kept the porch light on every night, as if waiting for a son who would never come home again. Shad's absence was a vacuum. His voice, his shoes by the door, his cereal bowl in the sink, all gone. But what made it worse was how he was remembered in the public eye. Not for who he was, not for the music he liked or the way he spoke softly to animals. He was remembered as the man whose head was found in a bucket, a victim of horror, a footnote in someone else's madness. That's the cruelty of violence. It takes away your story and replaces it with someone else's nightmare. People who had known Taylor before everything unfolded found themselves caught between disgust and disbelief. Her former teachers, her childhood neighbors, some even cried, not out of sympathy but out of confusion. How does someone fall so far? What do you do with your memories of her smile, of her as a little girl playing in the yard, when now all you can picture are the headlines? Some tried to forget, others tried to explain, but most simply let the silence do the work. It was easier to pretend she had always been a monster, because to admit she hadn't been, to admit that they saw her growing darkness and looked away, was too much to bear. In town, whispers turned into conclusions. She was evil. She was possessed. She must have snapped. But none of those words were the truth. Taylor didn't snap. She unraveled, slowly, publicly, tragically, and no one caught her before she fell. The few who did try to reach her, an aunt, a former friend, an old boyfriend, carried their own kind of grief. They'd remember texts she never replied to, voicemails they left, warning her to get help, the times they nearly called authorities then second-guessed themselves. They'd think, if only I'd tried harder, if only I didn't walk away. But guilt doesn't bring the dead back, and it doesn't fix what's already broken beyond repair. There was no real justice in this story, no redemption, no grand statement about the system fixing itself. Just the same cold truth that always lingers in the wake of tragedy. We saw the fire starting, and we walked away before it burned the house down. If there was anything left to salvage from this devastation, it was the chance to look deeper, to stop writing people like Taylor off as crazy or beyond help, to ask harder questions when someone spirals, to speak up when someone talks about violence like a joke, to stop pretending that meth, trauma, and untreated mental illness are just someone else's problem. Because monsters aren't born, they're built. One neglect, one missed sign, one failed system at a time. Taylor's name would always be remembered by some as the woman who killed and dismembered a man she once kissed. Taylor's name would always be remembered by some as the woman who killed and dismembered a man she once kissed. But to others, she'd be the face of something more frightening, a symbol of what happens when society doesn't just fail one person, but everyone around them too. Shad's memory deserved more, not just candlelight vigils or social media tributes, but real remembrance, the kind that insists on telling the whole truth, that he was more than his final moments, that he was someone worth knowing, worth loving, worth saving. He shouldn't be defined by how he died, but by how he lived, the kindness he showed, the patience he gave, the innocence he carried even when the world around him was crumbling. And in a way, that's what makes this tragedy so unbearable. Because in the end, Shad loved someone who couldn't love him back, who didn't know how, who took everything from him and left nothing behind but questions and blood. But in his memory, people began to talk differently about mental health, about substance abuse, about the people in their lives who scare them, confuse them, worry them. And sometimes that's the only justice we get. Change, Quiet, slow, but change. So what do we do with a story like this? We remember Shad, we speak his name, and we promise to listen